In today's homily, I'm going to continue with the theme of time that I started last week. And so I picked two very, very short passages from John's Gospel, actually just single line passages that talk about the conundrum of time. And so since they're very short, I need to give you a little context to it so it's not over and done with before you realize what's happening. So Jesus makes many, many mystical statements, particularly in John's Gospel, that begin with the phrase, I am, like I am the light, I am the life. Now, the thing is, there's no present tense of the verb to be in Hebrew. You can't actually say, I am in Hebrew. And so you have to get around it by either what's called predication without a verb, or by changing the tense. And so, for instance, in that famous passage where Moses has an encounter with God at the burning bush, and this God wants to send him back into Egypt, where Moses is wanted for murder. And Moses, I don't even know who you are. When I go back and tell the Israelites, God sent me back, and they said to you, what God are you talking about? How do you identify yourself? And God says very famously in Hebrew, Ehiyeh Ashir Ehiyeh, which is always mistranslated as I am who I am. You can't say I am who I am in Hebrew. So what happens is, Ehiyeh Ashir Ehiyeh is a future tense. It says, I will be who I will be. And what that says to me is that isness is not time-bound. Rather, time is a kind of, in some senses, part of the incarnational illusion. And so when I pick these two passages, very, very short, I'm wrestling with the illusion of time. So the first one is from John's Gospel, chapter 1, verse 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And the second is from John chapter 8, verse 58. And in order to understand this clearly, you have to realize that Abraham, who's referenced in this reading, was born about 1,850 years before Jesus. But here's what Jesus had to say about Abraham. Truly, truly, I tell you, before Abraham was, I am. These are words inspired by God. I spent 8 years in this seminary training to be a missionary priest between 1964 and 1972. And so, along with all of the other things they asked us to study, like theology and scripture and history, the church and stuff like that, the last year was spent on developing a notion of community development. And this was a system where they teach you how to go into a brand new culture, learn a completely different language, and then begin to understand what are the felt needs of the community that you're now going to serve. And so, in other words, you have to identify who the leaders are, what the resources are, what the needs are, what the problems are, and what the solutions to the problems might be. And so I went to Kenya on the 8th of November, 1972, and I spent a few months learning Kiswahili. And then I got my first real appointment. I was put in charge of a huge, big, sprawling parish called Eldama Ravine, early in 1973. And I'm at a meeting one day with a group of the elders. It was kind of a semi-desert area, very, very dry, very, very barren. And I'm sitting on rocks with this group of elders, and I'm pontificating. You know, I'm 26 years old, I'm Irish, I know everything. And so I begin saying, you know, I understand you guys are the leaders. You know, I understand here are the resources we have available to us. I know what the felt needs of the community are, like water, for instance. I know what the problems are here, and I want to figure out a few solutions to the problems. And there's this old man looking kind of smilingly at me during this entire diatribe of mine. And finally he puts up his hand and he says, can I ask you a question? I'm Irish, I know everything. So absolutely, fire. And he says to me, can you tell me why it is that for you Europeans, your only response to a problem is to want to solve it? And I'm saying, dude, what do you do with a problem except solve it? I'm totally stuck. For the first time in my life, and hopefully the last time, I wasn't able to come up with an answer. So I said to him, what do you do when you have a problem? And I will never forget what he told me. One of the greatest learnings of my life. We're talking Kiswahili, but more or less what he said, a problem is an invitation to self-transcendence. And if all you do with the problem is solve it, life will just give you another problem. And if you're only responsible, the response to the second problem is to solve it, life will give you a third problem. And it was probably one of the wisest things anybody has ever told me. I probably learned more in that 10-second encounter than I did in 8 years of seminary training. And what I realized is that self-transcendence immediately involves stepping outside of time. In order to self-transcend, you have to go trans-temporal. Also, you need to go trans-spatial and transpersonal as well. But you certainly have to go trans-temporal. You got to step outside of time. And that's what I've been trying to cover for the last 2 weeks, the notion of time. So last week, for instance, I talked about time and its various illusions. And I talked about this famous passage from the book of Ecclesiastes. There is a time for everything under heaven, a time for war, a time for peace, a time to kill, a time to heal, etc. And I talked about fractals, particularly fractals of time. And then I talked about parallel lifetimes or timelines, as well as parallel processing. So today I want to continue with that examination of the phenomenon of time. And again, today I'll focus on 3 main areas. Firstly, I'm going to kind of lead into the topic very gently through using metaphors, particularly metaphors from childhood experiences. And then secondly, I'm going to talk about incarnation and the illusion of time. And then thirdly, I'm going to talk about science and its illusions around the notion of time. So let me get into it first as very, very gently talking about childish kind of metaphors or childhood metaphors. I'm coming to believe that time is a toy that God created for his incarnated children. Time is a toy that God created for his incarnational children. It's a little bit like a loving father who makes all of these glittery artifacts and hangs them over the crib of his newborn infant. Because there's a huge correlation between a child's IQ level subsequently and the amount of sensory stimulation it gets in the first few months of lifetime. And so the child needs to see things, it needs to reach out and feel things, it needs to put things in its mouth, it needs to hear stuff. And so a father who creates this stuff over the crib, so it's dancing, it's different colors, it's making sounds, whatever, that's really, really important for a child's development. And so in some senses, time is just an illusion that God makes up, a toy that God invents to kind of improve our sensory abilities during incarnation. And so, for instance, to use another metaphor, it's like a mother feeding her little baby, like her 6-month-old baby who's sitting in a high chair, and there's a bowl in front of the little child, and the mother is breaking up the food into little bite-sized pieces. The mother's not going to put a steak into the bowl and expect the child to chew on it. So the mother's going to break it up into tiny little pieces so that the child can easily digest it. Now, time, in some senses, is what Mother God does for us in order to break up the pieces of incarnation so that we can process them sequentially. Let me use a third example. We've all seen situations where, I'd say at Christmas time, a little child comes downstairs, really, really excited, maybe 18 months old, and there's a parcel for the little child there. And the child is told, that's for you. And the child is really excited. And it tears off the bow, and it tears off the wrapping paper, and it opens the box, and then there's this very, very precious gift inside it. And what does the child do? The child ignores the gift. No interest in the gift. Is fascinated by the wrapping paper and by the box. And so the child will spend a lot of time playing with the wrapping paper and the box. Now, what is the gift that's inside in the box? The gift inside in the box actually is the opportunity to harvest the now for its psycho-spiritual possibilities. And time is merely the box and the wrapping paper. But most of us spend all our time playing with the box and the wrapping paper. And we don't realize that there's a gift inside in the box, and the gift is the opportunity to harvest the now for its psycho-spiritual possibilities. And in that model, I believe that even evolution itself is an illusion. It means simply taking away the wrappings to reveal the present of the fully gifted now. That's what evolution means. It's not discovering new possibilities. It's unwrapping and now spending time. The gift is the ability to see the now from the past and the future in our modality. So there's just a few metaphors from childhood. Let me look then at the kind of the illusions of time that are part of the incarnational experience. I believe that once we incarnate, we're subject to 4 very significant kind of limitations, very significant limitations. The first one is the limitation of space. Before we incarnated, we were not confined to these tiny little 8-pound bodies stuck inside, in a womb, attached to mummy with an umbilical cord. We were these cosmic entities. We were beyond space, completely beyond space. And now we have to deal with the cramped conditions in which we find ourselves. And even after birth, I'm dealing with the limitations of being inside in a 150-pound body as a 75-year-old male. Every one of us is locked into this tiny little space capsule. That's the first limitation. The second limitation is the limitation that we're now trying to operate with this tiny little laptop that we carry between our ears. And the function of this laptop is not to create consciousness. It does not create consciousness. Rather, it's an antenna, like a receiver and a transmitter of previously existing consciousness. A lot of you will watch the Super Bowl today. The Super Bowl is not taking place inside your television set. If your television set breaks down, the Super Bowl is still happening down in LA this morning. And so the brain is simply a transmitter and a receiver of electromagnetic signals of events that are happening elsewhere. So the brain, that is the function of the brain. It's more like a filter or a reducer in order to help us to avoid sensory overload. If we had to try to process everything that the senses feed to us, even in a 10-second segment, the brain would just literally explode. So there's a filtering system, a reducing system in the physical brain that totally filters down. It turns the faucet, the flow, way down to a trickle so we can process it and not go crazy. So that's the second limitation, the tiny brain. The third limitation is that this brain then creates the illusion of time. It has to break up the entire gestalt, even of an incarnational experience, into bite-sized pieces that we then process sequentially, giving rise to the illusion of time. So time is an illusion of the brain's capacity to process information. And then the fourth limitation is amnesia. And we have amnesia for two things particularly. We have amnesia for who we really are. And so we tend to identify with our ego instead of our soul. We tend to identify with our role self, the character we're playing in a particular incarnation, rather than our soul self, the eternal aspect that just volunteered to take part in a particular drama in life. And the second part of amnesia is amnesia for the mission. There's not a single person on planet Earth who didn't raise their hand and say to God, send me, I will go. And my function will be to wake up the world to Christ consciousness, our Buddha nature, our Krishna mind, whatever word you want to give to it. That is the mission for which every single one of us incarnated in our own way. And the vast bulk of us have totally forgotten what that is. And so we're living in this illusion of time. And in that model, then, I believe that memory is not recalling the past. It's realizing that there is only a present, and a present is a pun in English. Present means now, and present means gift. So it's the gift of the eternal now. So memory is another illusion. We're not recalling stuff from something that happened way back. We're simply realizing that there is only the now, and we transcend the brain's capacity momentarily to realize that. Now, I think that when we're locked into this illusion of time, we create 7 different timelines, 2 in the past, 2 in the present, and 3 in the future. And we are products of all these 7 timelines. So in the past, we create 2 timelines, one of which is what actually happened in the past, and we're products of that. And the other thing is the history that the victors wrote that told us this is actually what happened in the past, and we're products of that as well. It's fictitious, but we're products of it because that's what we've been taught. So we're products of both the real past and the fictitious past of the historians. We're products of the present moment, and there are 2 versions of the present moment. There's what's really happening in our world right now. And then there's the propaganda that's telling us what's happening in the world right now. And we're products of both of them. We are really products of what's really happening now, even if we don't know most of it, because the propaganda is a false version of what's happening. But we're products of the propaganda as well as what's really happening. And then we're products of 3 kinds of future. The first one is the notion that there's a fated inevitability over which we have no control, that we're able to predict sometimes. There is no such thing, I believe, as a fated inevitability. There are basically only 2 versions of the future, as there are 2 versions of the present and 2 versions of the past. And the two versions of the future are the probable future and the possible future. And we're products of both of those. Now, the function of a prophet, I've said to you many, many times, the prophet is dealing with the probable future. What's likely to happen if we don't change our ways. That's the probable future. The function of the prophet is not to predict the future as if it were a fated inevitability. The prophet does not predict the future. The prophet's function is to prevent the future, to prevent the probable outcome of our present craziness. The function of the prophet is not to foretell the future, it is to forestall the future. So the function of the prophet is to help us create a possible different future from the probable one that awaits us if we don't change what we're doing. So we are products of teleology as much as we are of history. Telos is the Greek word for perfection. So when it says, for instance, when Jesus says, you must be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect, we think that perfection is living a stainless steel, sinless life. Has nothing got to do with that. Perfection has to do with being radically committed to the purpose for which you incarnated. It means remembering completely who you really are and why you really volunteered for incarnation. That is what the perfection means, teleology. And so, for instance, a little acorn that falls off a tree is absolutely perfect. It contains everything it needs in order to become a great oak tree itself. And no matter what circumstance it finds itself in, it will try its damnedest to send down roots in order to grow into this great tree. This is what perfection consists of. And so as we think about the timelines, it becomes very, very important that we create the possible future rather than submit to the notion of a fated inevitability or just go along with the probable future because we're not prepared to change what we're doing. When I look at the near-death experience literature, what I see there is that people report a kind of a 360-degree wraparound sense of vision. They literally can see all around them. They're not just committed to what's straight ahead. They can see 360 degrees, almost like not even just in a circle, but in a sphere, three-dimensionally in a sphere. And they talk about the life review in which the entirety of the incarnation just ended is immediately available in absolute detail in the now. It's not going to take them like 10 years to review 75 years of incarnational history. It's all available now. So here again, we have the notion that time is obviously an illusion of incarnation. Now, Eckhart Tolle said very famously in one of his great books one time, he said, you've never done anything in the past. You have never done anything in the past. You did something in a present moment, which is now part of your memory bank. But it was a present moment when you did it. You never did anything in the past. And you can never do anything in the future. When you do something, it'll be a present moment that is yet to come. So there is only the now. You can only act in the now. Now, the question is, how quickly can you realize that? How long would it take you, for instance, to read a 400-page book? 40 hours, maybe? Yeah. But you could download that book from Amazon onto your Kindle in about 40 seconds. So the Kindle will download it 3,600 times faster than you're able to read it. And so time is an artifact of processing intelligence, not of reality itself. Time has to do simply with our processing speeds, not with reality itself. And an enlightened soul can instantaneously process all that is now. So that's what I mean by the illusions generated by time. So let me talk then finally about science and its illusions, particularly around the notion of time. The four basic elements of science are space, time, matter, and energy. The entire scientific model is predicated, on these four components: space, time, matter, and energy. And they believe that there are four forces. There's the strong nuclear force, the weak nuclear force, gravity, and electromagnetism. Now, since the time of Einstein, they've been trying to create what's called a theory of everything that will hold and bind these four forces together, and they can't do it. And they'd never be able to do it, in my opinion, because they're losing out a main ingredient that they're not prepared to factor in, because they're bound for the main part into a materialistic model of the cosmos. Until they factor consciousness into the equation, they will never unify these four forces or have an adequate theory of everything. Now, they can't even define what consciousness is. I've never come across a scientist or a psychologist or a philosopher who's able to tell me what consciousness is. So about 10 days ago, I had a dream. And sometimes when I'm going to sleep at night, I pose a kind of a question, to the higher self, give me a dream, that speaks to a particular issue. And so I said, tell me something about, consciousness. Give me a definition of consciousness. And I got a 4-word definition just off the bat in the middle of a dream. It said, consciousness is simply source-saturated self-awareness. Consciousness is source-saturated self-awareness. And until science begins to build that into its model, there's never going to be a theory of everything. They're beginning to move in that direction gratefully. There's a whole new branch of science called biocentrism, which is the realization that life is core and that everything else, including space and time and matter and energy, emerge from life or emerge from consciousness. So if you're interested in this topic, books on biocentrism, particularly by a guy called Robert Lanza, are really, really a great start to that. So I want to end, if Ed Hannibal is here this morning, this is for you, Ed. It's interesting to me that Planck length, the notion of Planck length, Max Planck was the very, very famous father of quantum theory. And Max Planck, they talk about Planck length, the shortest possible distance, and Planck time, the shortest possible timeline. These are science's feeble attempts, in my opinion, to force continuity of time and continuity of space on what are really discrete, separate quanta or chunks. So here's what the definitions are, the formulas. A Planck length is 1.616255 by 10 to the power of minus 35 meters. It's for you, Ed. And a Planck time is 5.39 multiplied by 10 to the power of minus 44 seconds. So Planck time is the amount of time required for light traveling through a vacuum to traverse a Planck length. That's how short these little chunks are. So to illustrate it in a non-kind of scientific fashion, I want to share a story that happened when I was studying physics, at the university. And the professor offered this conundrum to us. He said, there is a huge locomotive, a train, 1,000 tons barreling along from east to west at 80 miles an hour. And in the opposite direction is a mosquito. And the mosquito is flowing from west to east at 1 mile an hour. And they crash into each other. And what happens when they crash? It's a mathematical reality that you can't be traveling in this direction at a positive speed and then reverse yourself without instantaneously coming to a complete stop. You can't go from 80 miles an hour east to west to going, 1 mile an hour west to east without stopping momentarily. There has to be a moment in which there's zero speed or zero velocity. Now the professor says, so the mosquito hits the train is going 80 miles an hour, 1,000 tons of it from east to west, and the mosquito is going from west to east at 1 mile an hour, and they crash. And so now the mosquito is also going at 80 miles an hour from east to west. But there was a moment when the mosquito was at a total standstill, a speed of 0. And presumably that was when he hit the train. Now, if the mosquito is traveling at a speed of 0 when he hit the train, then the train must have been at a speed of 0 when it hit the mosquito. And so if there's a whole range of mosquitoes hitting the train is jumping, discretely, discontinuously. And that's what they're trying to get around with the notion of a Planck length and a Planck time, the shortest possible measure of time and the shortest possible measure of distance. And what's happening is you put all these together in such a fashion that you don't see the distinction between them. The human eye can only process stuff at the rate of 1/23 of a second visually. If something happens faster than 1/23 of a second, the human eye won't process it. And so here's the paradox I leave with you then as you consider time. Did the mosquito stop the train? Namaste, my brothers and sisters. I want to make this kind of a statement. All of us have intentions for each Eucharist we attend, and I've got a different, kind of a personal, a motive or a dedication of my masses every time I say Mass. Today, I want to dedicate my Mass to the extraordinary truckers of Canada. It's interesting to me that over 2,000 years ago, the greatest freedom movement ever the world had seen was not done by politicians. It was done by a bunch of fishermen and a carpenter. And it'd be fascinating to me to look at how freedom is going to come to our world, not by politicians anymore, but by a bunch of truckers, men and women in Canada. And I'm dedicating my Mass today to the truckers of Canada.